years ago at this conference, Wilson Miner gave a talk. I imagine a lot of you have seen it, called When We Build. And in that talk, he drew a connection that stayed with me. And he argued kind of the way that roads and cars and freeways shaped the world around us 50, 60 years ago. Screens were shaping the world around us today and would continue to do so for decades to come. And that raises a question, right, which is, what future are we building here, given that we have such a pivotal role in such a transformative process? And I think our industry actually hasn't done a great job of giving an answer to that question as a whole. So this is an idea I've been revisiting a lot ever since he gave that talk, and recently I've started to form my own answer. And I found my answer not by kind of looking back at our history, the history of our field, but not looking at kind of the history that I think we're all used to looking at, but by looking at a different kind of history. So what I wanted to talk about today was where I've been looking and kind of the answers that I've been getting from that history. And I want to start by talking about the history that Wilson was talking about in his talk, which is the history of kind of roads and cars and freeways. So this is Thomas McDonald. He was the chief of the Bureau of Public Roads in America, and it's now called the Federal Highway Administration. And he was the kind of the chief architect behind the American Interstate Highway System, which is this massive collection of roads that joins the whole country together. And it's the kind of skeleton for the transformation that Wilson was talking about. In 1924, he outlined his dream as such. My aim is this: we will be able to drive out of any county seat in the United States at 35 miles per hour and drive into any other county seat without cracking a spring. So what I like about this quote is that it's a vision. It's a description of the future and what the world will be like when he's done with his work. And I think it's the kind of answer that Wilson would want to hear from us, and it's the kind of statement that I think we should be able to get to. He also wrote, next to the education of the child, road building is the greatest public responsibility. I don't know if he's right. I think a stable economy is pretty important. But I think it's really important that he felt that way. This vision drove his work. It informed a lot of the decisions that he made. Toll roads, for example, were one of his big enemies. They're kind of counter to this kind of democratic populist vision that he had, that this should be for everyone. He kind of famously opposed all toll roads in the country, including depriving funding to the Golden Gate Bridge, just because it had a toll. And I think many of us don't have answers like McDonald's. I think we might have some answers, but I don't think they'd be our answers, not in the way that McDonald's answer was his answer. I think the designer answer, more often than not, comes from someone else. The vision that we build towards as designers often comes from a founder or a CEO or a PM, depending on your organization. And so there's this distance, I think, that exists between the vision that we're building and the work that we actually do as designers. I think it's the distance between what something is and how that something gets expressed on the screen. I think this distance is actually goes back pretty far in the history of design. It's not something that's unique to software, and I think you can see it when you look at the way that we talk about our history as designers. When you look at the kind of the masters that we study, when we talk about our heritage, we talk about works like this, or this, or this. And I think these comparisons make intuitive sense, and they make gut level sense. Because when you're sitting at your desk and you're pondering your work and you're reflecting on your output, they don't look too different, right? Ultimately, our work does get expressed in the language of graphic design. So I think these connections are perfectly logical. But there's something that runs through these works that is important, and that's that the most important thing actually resulting from this work is not something that the designer did, right? Paul Rand didn't engineer the first hard drive at IBM. Vignelli didn't conceive of or engineer the New York City subway system. Joseph Mueller-Brockmann certainly didn't write any of Beethoven's symphonies. Their work was always in service of something else, something that existed outside of their work, something that was created by someone else completely. And their role in the project was one of a communicator, of a facilitator, translator, marketer, something else, something in the middle that lied between the important thing, the creation, and the customer, the audience, the user, however you want to describe it. But that something else is actually where all the value lies, right? Because if there is no something else, then there is nothing to design for. that is kind of the center of the work. And I think this is where interactive design was, and still is in large part, but I think it's beginning to shift. So for us as designers on the web or on mobile or any kind of interactive product, you generally have the product specs and the product requirements over here, the engineering over here, which you translate as a designer as an interface in the middle to an end user over there. So it's literally what the word interface means, right? The point where two systems interact. By definition, if your only responsibility is the interface, then you're not the actual creator of the value. You're kind of the communicator or the translator of the value. And this runs across a lot of the ways that we talk about design. Here's a classic definition that I think we've all seen. Design is the method of putting form and content together. And this is an idea that this is an old quote, but it's held up over time. Here's a more contemporary iteration of it. Content precedes design. Design in the absence of content is not design, it's decoration. And it's not just content that this is true of. You can see it here with products. This is one of the 10 principles of good design, Dieter Rams. Good design makes a product useful. So see how design and the product are kind of held as separate objects in this quote. You know, there's the radio, and that's a thing. And then there's how the radio gets expressed in the design, and that's a different thing. And the designer's responsibility is the expression, not the thing. You know, in other words, design is a step in a process that was kind of initiated by someone else. So I think this thing of being in the middle, of being this kind of in this communication role, this translation role, it runs really deep into our identity as designers. But what I'm seeing is that for many of us working on the web or working on software, this is beginning to be an incomplete picture of our work and an incomplete definition of what design is. I think the industry is changing, and consequently, I think what it means to be a designer is changing. Over the course of my personal career, there's kind of been this progression. My earliest work was kind of interface projects that began with wireframes or sketches. They were passed down to me by a client, you know, kind of a CEO or a PM or a founder that would say, okay, here's kind of how it's roughly going to be laid out. Can you just go make it look really good? I think a lot of us have been in that kind of role in a design project before. So I kind of take the wireframes and kind of color them in and kind of spread usability as much as I could into these nooks and crannies of the system. But ultimately it was a system that was defined for me. And I think as I progressed, you do that long enough, and it becomes more typical to do the wireframing yourself, right? Instead of starting with the wireframes, you start with a set of product requirements, and then it's up to you as a designer to kind of design the layouts and the flows and the interactions. And then this model works really well, and it's a model that most of us know as the responsibility of the designers in most software. I think this is definitely the model that most of the industry certainly thinks of as the role of the designer. But this also in my career began to change, and I started becoming involved a lot more with the product development process and the product requirement process, helping teams kind of develop whole products from scratch. And what that means is that my work didn't start with some defined notion of a specific product or a specific feature set or a specific scope, but kind of something much more abstract, right? Like a goal or a vision or a description of how things could be different. Like with Thomas McDonald, and there's nothing really there, right, except for an aspiration. Even that too, I think, is beginning to shift, but I think that's another topic for a different talk. So this is a description of my personal career path, but I don't think it's particularly unique. I think it's something that I'm seeing a lot across our whole field and across many of the designers that I know. It's this trend of designers creeping to the tops of organizations and into the beginnings of processes. And I think we're almost to the point where, maybe we're already there, that these observations are kind of boring or obvious. Design, I think, finally has its seat at the table, and that's kind of non-controversial. And I think this is the defining quality of interactive design, or at least it will be over the next few years. Because that's something else that I was talking about. That's something else that was so definitional for graphic designers of the past isn't a something else anymore. It's ours to define as designers, right? That's now our process. It's the ability to kind of create something from nothing, nothing more than a loose goal. There's this Steve Jobs quote, which again I imagine all of you know very well and gets thrown around. Design is how it works, not how it looks. But I think it's actually gotten bigger than that, or it's beginning to get bigger than that. I think design is actually what it is from scratch. So I think when we look at graphic design and the history of graphic design and these more these older forms of design, we're looking actually at a very different process than what our process is beginning to look like. It's that process of communication, of translation, not of creation, that is starting to define most of our work. So think in the past, when people talked about creation and building something from nothing, we called that process not design, we called that process invention. So what I'd like to propose today is that designers are now in the business of invention. There's a little part of me, I think, that chokes on this word. It seems a little silly sometimes when I think about it. I think when I picture inventors, I picture these kind of sepia-toned guys in labs wearing, goggles and playing with beakers and dealing with things on the atomic level, right? Particles and microscopes. And I think our work as designers feels very distant from that. Certainly when we look at ourselves at the office. But I don't actually think they are too different in practice, design and invention. At the root, both processes are they hinge on creating something new based on an insight that nobody's ever had before. For example, on the invention side, we discovered how vacuums were created, and that led to the invention of the light bulb. Capacitive touch displays led to the creation of the iPhone. I think those are very simple, easy to understand examples of kind of how a discovery led to something brand new. They're very clear technical insights that led to development. But in many cases, the key insights of the products that we work on in the world of software haven't actually relied on technical insight. Twitter, I think, is a really great example of this. Twitter was technically possible for a long time before it was created. But the insight that makes it so good that character limitations kind of enable this totally different form of communication, a totally different way of connecting with each other. That insight wasn't well known or well understood before the creation of Twitter. And to be clear, I'm not saying that the creators of Twitter were consciously tapping into this discovery. I don't think it's necessary that kind of the insight comes before the creation. I think often it's the pursuit of a vision that kind of leads to the insights. But the dependency is still there in the sense that Twitter is successful because of this insight that nobody had ever had before. And I think you can tell nobody's ever had that insight before, or at least it wasn't broadly understood by the world, because we would have had it immediately as soon as it was technically possible. Right? It wasn't some urge we were all itching to scratch that we were just waiting for the tech for. So I think taken in this sense, you can think of design and invention as having kind of a shared definition. I think they're both simply applied discovery. There are many creations that do depend on technical innovation. So this isn't a talk about design being superior to engineering or something like that. My point is more that a single social insight, like the one that Twitter has, can be the central driver of where the value comes from in a product. My point is that the kind of the magnitude of a social insight or a behavioral insight or whatever you want to call that can be equivalent to an insight on a technical basis. So we use different terms to talk about this process of discovery and the application of discovery, but I think it's in our benefit as designers to treat them as something more unified. It gives us a kind of a new pool to study from. And it's not that this is like a unique phenomenon to software design either. History is filled with this kind of non-technical progress. Schools, political systems, economic systems, all of these things kind of have non-technical basis. They're actually pretty similar in a lot of ways to the software that creates today. The way information is accessed on Facebook, your friends can only see the things that you post. That's not a technical limitation, right? That's a conscious limitation put there to kind of facilitate a specific interaction between people. So there's kind of these artificial structures that are created to guide human interaction towards a desired end. And their insights, and the reason why they're valuable, schools, economic systems, political systems, social software, their insights come from an understanding of relationships between people and between groups, and not from some piece of technology that was being freshly discovered. I think basketball is actually is one of my favorite examples of this kind of process of non-technical discovery and insight, because it's so recent that we can actually study it. A lot of other sports, it takes millennia to develop, and there's not really some clear designer at the wheel, if you want to use the term. But in this case, James Naismith was actually a singular person who just came up with the rules of basketball, and so it's a really cool story to study because it's just a single person with a vision that they executed on. So the basketball started because Naismith was a teacher in New England, and during the winters it was so cold that they couldn't really play any outdoor sports, and the kids would get rowdy, and it was really problematic for the school. And so his boss kind of handed him down a set of product requirements, and they looked like this: keep the kids in shape, make it fair for everyone, not too rough. He had no budget, and he had a 2-week turnaround time. So a pretty awesome client. But he did it. He crafted the rules, a simple document, 2 pages in total, I think 13 rules altogether. And basketball now is the most played sport by American teenagers. There are professional leagues in almost every country in the world. And I think it's an incredible achievement, right? Because there was no technical discovery required. Basketball could have been created forever ago, right? It was just a repurposed soccer ball, football, and a couple of trash baskets that they had laying around at the school. And games in general, I think, are really fascinating for us to study because they're some of the oldest examples of this process of non-technical innovation that we have. So we have this evidence of this board game Senet being played in ancient Egypt as far back as 3000 BC. And this is a game that people still play today. So this is a game that's been fun for 5,000 years, right? So whatever universal aspect of humanity and fun and interaction that this game taps into, whatever that insight is, it's held true over an incredible time scale, right? Thousands of years. And I think when you think of your work as a designer, as depending on these kinds of discoveries, you realize that our work is both the discovery and the application of that discovery. So sometimes in software design, we like to lament that our work is because it's not physical, it doesn't last, right? It gets replaced within a few years because of some new piece of technology. But when you realize that the discovery is an important part of your work, you realize that a discovery is going to last forever, right? It's going to last 5,000 years, maybe even longer. I mean, I imagine Senet's going to be fun for forever, as long as people are around. So that has the potential to live much longer than anything you can manufacture. We don't need kind of the board game pieces that they played in ancient Egypt to kind of still enjoy the game today. So I don't think we should feel so bad about the kind of non-permanent aspect of our work. I think it's actually has a far greater shelf life than we imagine. And I think even when you study the history of technical innovations, you uncover that their real value wasn't often the technical piece, but rather technical innovations are remembered because of what they enabled in people's lives. So there's actually ends up, I think, being a lot of overlap with the kind of work that we do and the human impact and the social discovery. So I want to talk about the telegraph and its inventor, Samuel Morse, or one of the inventors. There's a lot of argument here. Samuel Morse is a really interesting guy because he's actually an artist for the bulk of his life. For the first 40 years of his life, he was a painter. And he painted portraits professionally. And he landed this really sweet gig in his mind to paint the General Lafayette, really important revolutionary in New York. And so he moved to New York from Connecticut to go paint this general, and he was so excited. This is a personal hero of his. And he wrote these letters to his wife, who stayed back in Connecticut. He was just kind of boiling over with excitement about this project. He was just so proud of it. And you can you read these letters that he wrote, and he's just beaming. And he sends these letters off to his wife. But the sad thing is that she never actually gets to read them because in the time between when he's left Connecticut to go to New York, she's fallen ill, and then ultimately she dies. And so she never gets to find out about this achievement that he had in his life. Because it takes like 5 days, a week, something like that, to get a letter from Connecticut to New York at the time. So he's been writing all of these letters, and she never gets to read them. And then the dude invents instant cross-country communication, right? So that's like a really cool way to turn the events around. And I think it's a great story. It's a very simplistic story. In terms of the reasons why he is motivated to do this, but I think it's a nice way to frame his achievement because it kind of contextualizes his work against why it matters to the world more than the technology and the technical insight that it required. Because his technology enabled connections with people that weren't previously possible. I think these days, when we look at our work, we kind of like to talk about how we're over-connected and how it's actually making us more lonely to be connected than before. But I think Morse was much lonelier than a lot of us because of this technology not being there. And I think it's actually really interesting that Morse is the person that most of us associate with the invention of the telegraph because he was a painter for most of his life. He wasn't a scientist, and his invention depended heavily on the works of others. Dozens of scientists who came before him discovered the most important parts of the telegraph, right? Electromagnetism, the design of the cables required, and he wouldn't even create the first telegraph. There was a couple of other scientists, Weber and Gauss, that created it, not Morse. And yet we remember Morse. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One reason is that his technology actually took off, where others hadn't. This is a sketch of a French scientist, Georges-Louis Lesage, and he invented a telegraph that could send complete written messages, only across a room, but it was effectively a very similar technology. And this is in 1774, so Morse wasn't even born yet. And yet we don't remember this guy for this. Well, some people do, but generally we not associate him with the invention. And I think the critical insight is that Morse created not just the technology, but Morse code, or at least him and the people working in his lab created Morse code. Because when you look at this, you can see there's actually 24 cables, one for every letter, in order to send a message. Morse code only requires a single cable, right? Because it's just one long message or one short message. And that could have been possible back then, but it wasn't kind of seen as a necessary component for this invention to work. And that's a non-technical insight, right? That you can use one cable and just encode language into a single electronic signal. And this actually is really important because one cable versus 24 cables is a completely different kind of game. You can construct a whole system of cables running across the whole country, but if you had to do 24 cables to 24 cables to 24 cables, it actually becomes kind of an intractable problem. It makes the technology easier, simpler, cheaper, and ultimately kind of something that scales across the entire world. But even though the technology was sound and he had all of these really critical insights for the invention, he had a pretty bad market fit problem in front of him, right? Because nobody actually had wires running across the country, so why would anyone buy a telegraph? And so Morse actually ends up spending the rest of his years, or at least a big chunk of his years after the invention, pursuing kind of the adoption of the technology. The invention was there, but actually getting people to use it was a whole different game. And so he ends up burning through all of his money in the process. He spends years of his life going totally broke. His best bet in his mind is to convince the United States Congress to build kind of a prototype cable that runs from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. to carry important political messages. And he can't do it. So this is in the middle of the Panic of 1837, which is the worst recession America had ever seen. And there wasn't a lot of optimism for federal funding for an unproven technology with unknown benefits. And again, a pretty bad client, right? The bankrupt United States government. But he fights and fights and kind of slowly convinces like one congressman at a time. And he's at this kind of this last pivotal moment. He's writing these letters where he's talking about how his hair is falling out and his vision is failing, and he just sees death as the next step in his life. And so there's this final vote, and he just barely scrapes by. It's like 89 to 82 votes or something, and he convinces the government to construct this cable, and it works. There's this very famous demonstration that he does. A very important piece of political news gets transmitted from Baltimore to DC, and people actually don't believe it at first. They also send someone on a horse to make sure that it actually really worked. But it's really cool. The cable is there. It only sends 30 letters per minute, so it's about 14,000 times slower than a 56K modem. But it's pretty sweet nonetheless compared to a horse. And his standard ends up becoming adopted across all of Europe, except the UK, I'll point out, and eventually all the way through South and Central America. And of course, this technology is kind of the foundation for a lot of the technology we use today, right? The television and the internet. So it's a pretty massively transformative creation. And the second half of the story, the story of the adoption of the technology, is kind of just as important to me as the initial invention, because I think it's a good example of how we tend to remember the people who not just invent something, but kind of successfully popularize it or commercialize it. We kind of remember Edison for the light bulb more than we do Joseph Swan, Bell with the telephone more than Gray, and there are bad reasons for this. I think like privilege and power, and these guys could be pretty bad people often. But I think it's still definitely true that the person who can take something out of a lab and spread it across into the world is someone that we actually really remember and care about quite a lot, because that's when the actual human impact is felt, right? That's when we actually recognize the significance of the technology, is when people's lives are being changed by it, which requires this ability to kind of create something that can flow throughout the world. So it's the human impact, right? Not the technical. So even when we look at technical insights, we talk about them in terms of kind of their social or human dimensions. So after reading stories like this of Morse and of Nesmith and McDonald, I started to identify some patterns in their work and themes that I think helped me think about my work, and it's helping me form answers to Wilson's question about the future that we're building. So some conclusions that I'm coming to for my own work. I see two important themes in a lot of these creations. They empowered people, and they empowered a lot of people. And taken together, we have kind of this rudimentary formula: empowerment times scale. So when I say empowerment, I mean it in a very broad sense. I mean it instantaneous communication with loved ones, or a new way to be healthy, the ability to travel with unprecedented access, or really any way that allows people to be healthy and long-lived and happy, closer to the ones they love, with the tools, technology, whatever they need to kind of be the person they want to be and sustain their lives. And with scale, what I'm talking about is how many people are being empowered in this way, right? How can you lower costs and eliminate barriers, whether that's pushing through infrastructure investment that runs across the whole country, or using one cable instead of 24 so that it's cheaper, or using cheap and existing materials to make it accessible to everyone in the world, or eliminating toll roads so that everyone with a car can use the system. Costs for us, I think, as designers, look a bit different, but they're very real. Bandwidth is a cost, accessibility is a cost, slow speeds are a cost, confusing interfaces are costs, complexity is a cost. So there are costs that we have to consider in our work. And I think scale also pushes us to solve universal problems, right? Financial stability, education, health. So I've kind of come to some of these conclusions, and they're rough, and I'm still kind of forming what that means for my work. But I came to these conclusions, right, not by studying graphic design or the history of graphic design, but by taking this kind of broader view of the work. And I don't actually think these are properties that you can meaningfully imbue into graphic design or even interaction design in the way that we talk about it. I think these properties actually come from these deeper layers of decision making, kind of this full stack of the process. What I would term product design. This is my definition. It's not the definition that a lot of people use. I think often these days product design just means someone who is a designer and there's a product there. But this is what I like to use, and this is how I think of it, and this is the definition I'm going to keep using. But I think it raises an important question, which is why us? Why should this be a design process, and why should designers be the ones doing this? So I think one immediate answer to me is that it lets me answer Wilson's question for myself, right? I have control over the future that I'm building by being involved in these processes. Many of us, I think, in the design field can only change our answer to this question by quitting jobs and going to find someone else whose vision you buy into. And I think that's a pretty sad state of affairs, that we don't have control over these things. But deeper, I think, actually, and less selfishly, I think we can actually be really good at this process of setting a vision and kind of defining what a product should be, because we're already really great at understanding what creates utility and what creates delight and beauty and motivation and all of these properties that you want in an interface, but you also want kind of running throughout a whole product. So I think this is actually a process that we can be really fantastic at if we applied ourselves and if we found opportunities to do that. So I think expanding that tool set to the bigger picture, it's not a huge leap. And I think we might be able to do it better than almost anyone. And this is a way of thinking about design that is growing in popularity, but I think it's still very much a minority, maybe even an extreme minority. But I'm pretty optimistic that this can change. When I look at kind of the history of our field, and this time I do just mean web design, you can see this kind of sustained progress, right? Where there are enough advocacy put in behind issues, with enough strength can really kind of continue to push the field forward, right? User-centered design, standards-based design, responsive web design, all of these things have continued to kind of flourish because we cared enough about them. So I'm pretty confident that we'll get there if enough people agree with this way of thinking about design. And I'll actually point something else out as well. We're living in a really perfect time for change as designers. Apple is this incredible example of a design-led company. It's the most valuable company in the world, and this kind of design-centric approach to product development is becoming somewhat of the default, right? It's certainly going to be taught in business schools, and it's going to become a kind of a standard way to think about creating things for people. And so in that sense, the demand for design is going up. Kind of like every organization wants more design for themselves, and at the same time, technology changes are lowering the barrier for getting into creating products. So infrastructure things like, AWS and frameworks like Ruby on Rails and so on are creating this world where you actually need like fewer engineers to build a thing, right? And so we're seeing kind of this flourish of, or this spread of more teams, right? So we have these combined forces, which is kind of a greater demand for design per team and just more teams, period. And what that means is that we're kind of in this really extremely valuable position as designers, right? Because the hiring market has tilted way on our sides. The demand for design has never been higher, and the demand for designers has never been higher. And this position in the hiring market puts us in a position of real power, actually, a power to work on our terms and to craft our roles, right? As much as we craft our work. And I think our peers are actually looking to us to lead them, right? They think design is the answer to a lot of these problems and the solution to kind of making good, sustainable, meaningful products. So I think we should embrace the fact that we can be leaders in organizations. And I think these are kind of the upsides and the good things about broadening this definition of design. But I think there are real risks to not broadening the definition of design as well. Some of the problems that arise if we don't kind of make this shift. So I think there's a temptation when your only domain is the interface or the interface and the visual design. I think there's a temptation when you're working in that band to kind of choose that as the spot to innovate in, right? To make the interface the thing that is the most interesting or the reason the thing is progressive. It's kind of your only tool is the hammer. Every problem looks like a nail phenomenon. But most users don't actually want novel interaction patterns, right? They want stable, familiar, obvious patterns, time-tested ones that they can carry from app to app, right? I think a good example here, going back to the physical world, is like if every car had a different steering wheel or approach to steering, right? Like some had tank controls, some had a controller, some had wheels. It'd be a pretty nightmare experience for people, but I think that's actually the experience we're creating for people often. I think we roll our eyes at page curl animations in iBooks, but I bet that convinced a lot of people that the iPad would actually make sense to them. So I don't blame Apple for starting there. And I think this narrow view of sticking ourselves into interaction design only, it actually threatens the integrity of our work, and it threatens our ability to do really good work. Because I think far too often a designer is charged with designing a product that actually has like fundamental problems, right? That will never make sense as a UI. And the feedback loops in a lot of organizations don't really move backwards most often, right? If you're handed product requirements as a designer and you just can't make it work, that's your fault. It's not the fault of the product requirements. And I think by owning both halves or this complete end-to-end process, each part of the puzzle can kind of move in response to every other part of the puzzle, and it creates this opportunity for harmony. And I think this is also why I think designers should code. But again, that's another subject for another talk. So here's a question that I want you to ask yourself, which is, if the project you were working on failed, if you built it and nobody wanted it and nobody used it, would you blame yourself, or would you blame someone else in the company? I think if you wouldn't blame yourself, then you probably do not have enough authority at your company. And if you're blaming others for the outcomes of your work, then I think it's time to demand more authority, and it's time to demand a different kind of role. So scale, empowerment, these are the answers that I've come to, but I think they're just my answers. I'm not asserting that they should be your answers. What I am asking you to do is this, which is realize that now is a very special time to be a designer. It's a time where we can create our roles for ourselves. We can have unprecedented authority, and we can create things from scratch and define a vision that changes the world. So what I want you to do is don't limit yourself, think as big as you can, and go invent something. Thank you.